Okay, so we're starting virtue ethics. We're starting virtue ethics with Plato. And in this video, I just want to introduce you to virtue ethics generally, and I want to introduce how Plato approaches philosophy in general, how you should approach, rather, Plato's philosophical writings. Okay, so virtue ethics. The name virtue ethics, or it as a name for an ethical theory, is not something that really arises until fairly recently, the 1950s. The reason for this is that for a very long time, virtue ethics was just how everybody in the Western tradition pursued ethical thought. And then, as changes happened to the way intellectuals, not just philosophers, but mostly philosophers, approached ethical questions, some people would look back in history at the way ethics used to be conducted, at the way we used to write about and think about ethics, and decided that it was its own theory that needed a name. Right? And so they came up with virtue ethics. And the reason they come up with virtue ethics as the name is that they thought it was precisely the lack of focus on the concept of virtue and on the virtues themselves. Because, just to be clear there, the concept of something and that thing itself is different. So like the concept of a horse and a horse are different things, for example. Right? You can ride a horse, you can't ride a concept of a horse. So both talk of the virtues was missing, they thought, from modern ethical theory, but also systematic discussion of the concept of virtue was missing. But that was all over ancient Greek and even medieval thought and writing about ethics. And so in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, some people started pushing to reintroduce virtue ethics. And they were right. They were right in that there was this change. If you look at ethical writing in the 1700s, 1800s, and even to some extent in the 1600s, you do find a much reduced focus on ideas about virtue. And a lot of this has to do with, strangely, the scientific revolution. So when the scientific revolution comes along, lots of scientific thinkers decide to ditch Aristotle. They decide that Aristotle's influence on scientific thought is bad. Right? Aristotle's way of conceiving of problems, Aristotle's way of conceiving of the natural world itself was fundamentally flawed, and we needed to start over. Interestingly enough, actually, the same people who were criticizing Aristotle's science were actually doing so usually from, not always, but usually from a position or an epistemological theory, which is a theory about knowledge and how you get it, that was basically Aristotelian. But for the most part, the scientific revolution was about throwing out Aristotelian ideas and coming up with what they thought were new ones. Very often they weren't new. Very often these were ideas that had already been developed, but that Aristotle hadn't agreed with. Okay, so there's the situation in the scientific revolution. What's that got to do with ethics? Well, what it's got to do with ethics is when they threw Aristotle away for science, they also kind of threw Aristotle away for ethics, and they threw anyone influenced by Aristotle away for ethics. And what that meant was they threw away basically all ethical thought from Aristotle on, because Aristotle was tremendously influential in ethics. The only ancient thinker who has any claim to being as influential as Aristotle was Plato. But if you were going to throw out Aristotle, you were going to throw out Plato too. Right? Plato's influence on the sciences was, from the perspective of people involved in the scientific revolution, really just as bad. Okay. So you have a sort of general intellectual rejection of thought from the medieval world and from the ancient Greek and ancient Roman world. They're going to create all new ethical theories. And in some ways they did. Not always. The two major ethical theories that came out of this sort of modern rejection of the ancient and medieval past, which are consequentialism and deontology, do clearly have their roots in some ancient approaches to ethics. And I'll talk about those a little bit as we go on. All right, right, so that's the explanation for how there got to be a theory that got the name virtue ethics, even though if you look back into great works of history, you won't find anyone saying they're a virtue ethicist. Plato never says he's a virtue ethicist. It would have been weird for Plato to think that anybody wouldn't talk about the virtues. Now, the word virtue itself, we get from Latin. The word virtue, actually, it's a little bit of a weird thing that the name is virtue ethics. I'm spending a long time on the name here, but virtue we get from a Latin word, and ethics we get from a Greek word. The Greek word is ethike. That's where we get the word ethics. And that just means having to do with character or concerning character. The Latin word for ethike, the Latin translation for it, was moralia, which is where we get the word morals or morality. Some people like to claim that ethics and morality are different things. They name totally different things. They don't. Ethics and morality are Anglicizations of a Greek word and a Latin word that mean the same thing. Now, you can, over time, have words come apart to where they used to mean the same thing, but now they don't. But really, apart from the people who claim, who just assert that ethics and morality mean different things, no one really uses them to mean very different things. I'm going to use ethics and morality interchangeably in this course because I think it's just a matter of historical fact. There is no real difference between the two. And certainly, if there is a difference, it's going to be minor. I had a professor once, he just passed away recently actually, who used to joke that in American English, morality has to do with sex and ethics has to do with money. So an ethical infraction had to do with stealing or defrauding someone, and a moral infraction had to do with having sex with someone you weren't supposed to. That was meant as tongue-in-cheek, but those are the kinds of small differences in how we use these words that are real. Anything beyond that is kind of, I think, silly. All right, so what about virtue? Well, virtue comes from the Latin word virtu, which was the translation of the Greek word arete. Here, I'll move this here so we can see this better. And arete was just the Greek word for excellence. You could have arete in anything. If you were a fast runner, you had arete with regards to running. You are an excellent runner. Right? If you were beautiful, that was a kind of arete. Right? You have an excellent appearance. So arete and virtue could mean lots of things that we don't nowadays mean by virtue. Right? We don't tend to say that because Usain Bolt is really fast that he's thereby virtuous. But originally, the Greeks would have identified what Usain Bolt has as a form of arete, of excellence. Ethike arete were excellences of character, though. And that's what we've come to use the word virtue to mean. Excellences of character, of personality, things like that, right? Excellences in the way that you behave, excellences in the way that you feel towards things, excellences in the way that you think about the world and approach the world. And these excellences are sort of stable features of your character, right? You're not excellent for a moment. It's not like Usain Bolt is fast for a second. Usain Bolt is always fast. Even when he's not running, he still has the ability to run really fast. Now, eventually he'll lose that ability. I mean, I guess if he dies really young, he won't. But if Usain Bolt lives to a ripe old age, he lives to be like 80 or 90, he's not going to be fast anymore at 80 or 90. So some of those physical excellences, they'll go away. Similarly with beauty, right? Lots of people who were beautiful at one point in their lives stop being beautiful later on, or stop being thought of as physically beautiful later on. So any kind of arete is supposed to last for a long time. It's not supposed to be momentary. But excellence of character, ethike arete, were in particular supposed to last a very long time. Like they would last longer than the other kinds of excellences. And that these kinds of excellences were therefore the most important. Right? And this is what Plato's talking about. Plato is talking about ethike arete. So if you put it in the order that the Greeks would have actually said it, it would be ethics, a virtue. Now, how did ethics get to mean what it means now, if originally it just meant concerning behavior? Well, it's because when you were discussing what the right thing to do and the wrong thing to do was, back in ancient Greece or ancient Rome, or in the medieval period in Europe, you inevitably talked about character traits. It was just sort of second nature to do that. The very fact that we use the words ethics or morality to talk about as like names for rules about right and wrong is actually just a way of showing how influential the approach to thinking about right and wrong through virtue used to be. We now use the word for character, right, to talk about right and wrong. So virtue ethics used to be so incredibly influential and sort of exclusively influential. Like no one thought you could talk about how you were supposed to behave without talking about stable, excellent character traits. It used to be so influential that the Greek word for character and the Latin word for character came to just mean in English, like the discussion of right and wrong, of duty and obligation and things like that, of good and bad. So, virtue ethics is an approach towards thinking about how you ought to behave that goes through talking about excellences of character traits that are good to have. And in ancient Greece, which is where this tradition gets started, because ancient Greece is really where all the traditions we still have in Western civilization get started. Not because they actually begin there for the very first time. It's not like the Greeks came up with all this stuff entirely on their own. It's just that before the Greeks, we don't have much record of what people were writing or thinking. Ancient Greece, while a long time ago, like Plato was alive 2,500 years ago, is still closer in time to us today than it is to the beginning of human civilization, right? So you've got Egyptians and Mesopotamians in like 4,000 BC. Well, that's 3,500 years from then to Plato, and Plato's 2,500 years from us. So it's not that nobody thought about what we now call ethics back in, 2000 BC or 3000 BC. But for one thing, we just don't have any books from then about ethics, not really. For another thing, and this genuinely does seem to separate the Greeks, but not all the Greeks, specifically Plato and Aristotle, from other thinkers. One really big difference, and we'll see that in the very first dialogue we're going to look at, the Euthyphro, is that organized religion didn't really have anything to do with what Plato and Aristotle had to say about ethics or morality. And prior to them, and even at their time, a lot of people thought, well, if you want to know how you're supposed to behave, you go ask a priest or other holy man, and they'll tell you what the gods want, and that answers the question. And the very first thing I'm going to have you read from Plato is Plato basically saying, nope, that's not it. We don't get right and wrong from the gods. Right? We're going to figure it out on our own because it doesn't come from there. Right. So in ancient Greece, in Plato's time, there were 4 or 5 so-called cardinal virtues, like the central virtues that everybody talked about. One was courage or bravery. And we use words courage and bravery nowadays to mean basically exactly what they meant back then. Right? Another was temperance. Nowadays, we associate the word temperance with the movement to ban alcohol. That's a restriction of its meaning. Temperance didn't always just mean avoiding getting drunk. Temperance had a much wider application. So one way to be intemperate was to fall down drunk. But another way to be intemperate, so not having temperance, having in fact the opposite of temperance. In fact, it would be good, I think, to put the opposites here. So on the other side of courage or bravery, you have cowardice. And on the other side of temperance, you have creatively intemperance. You could be intemperate by eating too much. You could be intemperate by wanting sex too much. You could be intemperate in a lot of ways, right? If you spend all your time playing video games, that's a kind of intemperance, or would have been thought a kind of intemperance by the Greeks if they had understood what video games were. But those two virtues, I think, are fairly straightforward. We can now also talk about wisdom, or I might say practical wisdom. And the opposite of that would be a kind of practical foolishness, let's say. So I'll just write foolishness. Practical wisdom was wisdom in how to behave. Now you might think like, well, if you have practical wisdom, if you have wisdom when it comes to how you ought to act, isn't that the whole thing? Like, wouldn't you do everything right if you had that? Plato's going to end up saying, yeah, but apparently before Plato, people just thought, no, wisdom's one and courage and temperance are the other. You can be wise, but cowardly. Right? And Plato's going to end up being like, no, I don't think so. Then there's justice. And the opposite is injustice. Nowadays, or the vice is injustice. Nowadays, we tend to talk about justice as a purely political issue. So that if somebody, if we talk about injustice, we're talking usually about the state or the laws or something like that being unjust. And for the Greeks, no, individual people could be just or unjust. And you can still occasionally find people talking this way. It's not an entirely archaic use of the word. A just person would be the kind of person who keeps their word, keeps their promises, right? Who treats people fairly. Nowadays, we'd be much more likely to talk about a person being fair or unfair rather than just or unjust. But you can still use that, I think, within the bounds of ordinary English. So those are the four cardinal virtues. I said there might be five. The other one is piety. And piety is probably the farthest in meaning, like what the Greeks meant by piety, it's the farthest in meaning from what we mean by it. Piety nowadays would be like, well, you have piety if you're like super religious, right? And you observe all the proper holidays. A pious person won't work on the Sabbath. A pious person won't say, God damn it, or something like that. A pious person will genuflect, right? If they're Catholic. I don't know if other people genuflect. Maybe they do. I don't know. But a pious Catholic, will genuflect. They'll do the little kneeling thing before they get in the pews. They will stay kneeling the whole time while communion is happening. They won't do that sit down thing. They won't pretend to have to find something when it's time to shake other people's hands and do the sign of the cross and stuff like that, right? So, sign of peace. But for the Greeks, piety covered a lot more, right? It wasn't just your duties toward the gods. It also meant your duties toward family members. So a child would be impious if they disrespected their father or their mother or other elderly relatives. Presumably also, I've seen it said anyway, that parents could be impious by not doing right by their children. So piety covered a lot more than just religion. It also covered your relation to the state to some extent. So obeying the laws or not obeying the laws. All right, so those were the cardinal virtues. And what that means is, if you were in ancient Greece and you wanted to know, okay, what does it take to have a good character? People would say, well, you'd have these things. And what Plato is talking about, especially in the first set of dialogues we're looking at, is, well, what are those things? And when I say Plato, what I really mean is Socrates. So in Plato's writings, Plato does not appear. What I mean by that is, let's take a look at the first reading, the Euthyphro. The Euthyphro is a dialogue. There are people talking. There's Euthyphro and there's Socrates. They're the only people talking in this dialogue. This dialogue was written by Plato, but Plato's not in it. Plato uses Socrates as a character in his dialogue. Now, the reasons why he does this are complicated, and we're not going to get into them really much now. Suffice it to say, Socrates was Plato's teacher, had a big influence on Plato when Plato was a young man, and so when Plato began to write philosophy, which he started doing after Socrates died, and you'll find a lot out about Socrates' death in this very course, in fact, the other readings for this week. If you, after Socrates died, Plato made Socrates the main character of his writings. We typically think that Socrates is expressing Plato's views whenever he appears. It's not always true, but we think it's normally true. And what this means is, though, that we get into this complication because Socrates was a real guy and he had other students beside Plato. And so there is this problem figuring out the difference between what the historical Socrates said and thought and what the character Socrates said and thought. In this class, we're only going to be focused on Plato, and so only be focused on the character Socrates. Just know there was a real Socrates, and he had real views, and he had influence on other people, people who disagreed with Plato about what Socrates really thought. The other problem that comes up here is that Plato changed his mind over the course of his career about some things. And also, it seems pretty clear that Plato ended up, even though he respected Socrates, disagreeing with Socrates on many important points. Now, everything I'm saying here right now is somewhat controversial among Plato scholars. There are Plato scholars who believe that somehow Plato never changed his mind across his entire life, and all the dialogues that he wrote are perfectly consistent with one another. I think that's so silly that we're not going to take it seriously in this course. And so I'm just going to be presenting you what's called the developmentalist account of Plato, which is that Plato changed his mind over time. He wrote the dialogues at different times of his life, and so sometimes the dialogues will contradict each other. In fact, I think it's clearest that Plato changed his mind when it comes to ethical issues. Plato says things in one dialogue that just directly contradict, I think, on any normal reading, what he says in other dialogues. And that'll be true even among the limited set of dialogues we're going to read for this course. In the Protagoras, Plato has Socrates argue for a view called hedonism. And in the Republic, he has Socrates argue against hedonism. And what seems to be going on here is that in the Protagoras, Plato has realized there's certain problems with the views that the real Socrates held. And he's trying to fix them. He's trying to come up with a coherent view for Socrates. And by the time he gets to the Republic, he's just decided there's no real way to make this coherent. Socrates' views, while admirable in many ways, didn't make sense. So I'm just going to present my views, my being Plato's. Only the confusing thing is it's still Socrates doing the talking in the dialogue. So whenever these complicated issues about, is this Plato disagreeing with Socrates, the historical Socrates, and using the character Socrates to do it? Is this Plato disagreeing with himself as a younger man? Both of which got expressed by Socrates, the character. Whenever those kind of issues come up, I'll flag them and I'll let you know what they are. Typically in dialogues, especially the early dialogues, which is what we're starting with. We're starting with the Euthyphro, the Apology, and the Crito. Typically in those dialogues, Socrates claims not to know the answers to the questions he's interested in. In the case of the Euthyphro, he's interested in piety. He wants to know what piety is. He wants to know this, and he asks Euthyphro about it because Euthyphro basically says he knows what it is. There's a lot to go through in the Euthyphro. There's a lot of interesting and valuable stuff to talk about, but we're going to focus primarily on something called the Euthyphro dilemma, which comes towards the end of the dialogue, and I'll make a separate video about that. Just know that Plato was interested in the virtues, and he was interested in the virtues because it seemed to him that the virtues answered an important question, and that question was, how should we live? Or what kind of life should I live? And what he didn't mean was, how should I act at this very moment? He meant, how over the course of my whole life should I be? Another way of asking this question is, I'll make a little room here. What kind of person should I be? That we're going to find when we get to the later authors is a very different kind of question than the question they're interested in. They're going to be interested much more, the later authors we read. And this is true of 20th and 21st century ethical thought as well. They're going to be interested much more in questions about, like, well, what should I do right now? Right? Here's a ethical puzzle. You're in this situation. How should you behave? Plato's not going to go into that. Plato's asking questions that are far more general. What kind of person should you be? What kind of life should you live? What kind of goals should you have that structure your whole life? And the answer to those questions in ancient Greece almost always came back to these things. The idea was, well, this is the kind of person you should be. You should be the kind of person with the virtues. And Socrates was, and then Plato was, and then Aristotle was interested in, well, what are these virtues really? What's involved in being courageous? What's involved in being temperate and wise and just and pious? What do you need to do in order to get those virtues? What will be distinctive about you if you have those virtues? And what really are those virtues when you get right down to it? That's what Plato's interested in. That's what the dialogues, all the dialogues to some extent are about. And it's what Aristotle's book is going to be about, which is what we're going to read after Plato. All right, this was an introduction to ancient Greek virtue ethics. And I'll pick up next with actually looking at the Euthyphro.